So we have our next briefing on domestic violence, and Patricia Castillo, who is one of our San Antonio Peace Laureates, works with the Peace Initiative and has dedicated her entire life, faith, civic service to putting an end to domestic violence. So Patricia, she's probably one of the most knowledgeable in the city. And with her is Rabbi Natanel Greenwald. He is serving on the domestic violence team that's trying to get the faith community more involved with this effort. And so I'm grateful to him. There seems to be somewhat of, we're talking about systems, there seems to be somewhat of a shortage when it comes to men participating in this effort to bring an end to this domestic violence. So we're grateful to you this morning, Rabbi, for being one of those men who have stepped up. And so I'm going to pass it to both of you. It's now yours, Patty and Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne, of course, and thank you everybody that's making this thing work behind the scenes. So as you said, really, Patricia is the pro here. She's the one that knows what she's talking about. I had the pleasure of speaking over the last few days. And what I think that perhaps I can share on this platform is a perspective, I guess, that calls to the faith community. Again, I'm not a mental health professional. I'm not a psychologist or a therapist. However, Patricia had just shared an article with me last night, Nowhere to Hide, by Emily Eaton, I believe. And it kind of highlighted, besides for the obvious issues that it points out in relation to domestic violence, it highlights the really something that's so natural is that systems are systems, and ultimately they take people to make them work. And although we have many systems in place and many systems that are getting better and stronger and working smoother, it still necessitates the individuals to kind of oil the gears, if you will, to make sure things work, things are happening, and things are really brought to the correct people's attention. So from a faith leader perspective, I think that's something that really falls on us. As I said, I'm not a mental health professional. But I am somebody who has a lot of relationships with individuals and with families. And I guess you could say my business, quote unquote, is people. And thank God, I believe that I've earned the trust of many, which is actually a difficult responsibility to carry. An acquaintance of mine once shared about a time that he reached out to an influential community member, not here in San Antonio, I have to point out, for some assistance with his crisis intervention organization. This was an individual whose support could really go a long way towards helping victims of substance abuse, domestic violence, etc. But the response that he received, and this might not be something new to you all, was that the issues that he was dealing with are blown out of proportion. It does not necessitate such a large scale response. The next time he heard back from this fellow was 3 years later, when the man was frantically calling him to help him with his son, who was in dire need of help. And he had nowhere else to turn but him. And suddenly all avenues were open: financial, legal, therapeutic, etc. It might not be the most original story. When he shared this experience with me, there was one thought that kept popping up in my head. It kept sticking out to me. This individual is by no means a bad person. He's probably very well intentioned, but his sphere of responsibility was likely limited to his immediate family and friends. He would go to the end of the earth for his own children, but was so completely detached from the suffering of others, he failed to realize that we don't quantify someone else's pain by our proximity to them. As civil servants, communal leaders, faith leaders, we don't have the luxury of having such a small sphere of concern and responsibility. We have people that rely on us, and we have a responsibility to our communities. Everybody at the end of the day is somebody's child. Every wife or girlfriend is the daughter of somebody else, and oftentimes the mother of someone as well. We can't afford to wait till it's on our doorstep until we address it. But I want to briefly address the unique role that men can play and must play as communal leaders and civil servants. You know, when a child, again, I'm not a mental health professional, but this I think is a given. When a child experiences domestic abuse, generally speaking, they have two models in front of them. Oftentimes, it's the mother who's the victim, and their father, or the dominant male in the house, who's the predator, the abuser. We don't need to hold a degree to know that, barring outside intervention of influence, the child has a very high chance of being victim to an abusive relationship in adulthood, or of perpetrating these very same abuses down the road. As men, we have a significant opportunity presented to us to positively influence the way that these children perceive what masculinity is and what it isn't. Not to be a controlling or dominant force, but to be a healthy male role model in their lives, capable of healthy relationships. Relationships based on mutual respect for the individual, not based on wielding power or utilizing fear, of course. And by standing up to abuse and empowering the victims, our very actions are already creating new possibilities for a child's future that simply did not exist in their life before. You know, they say all it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. The opposite rings true as well. All it takes to defend against evil is for us to do something about it. It's a large responsibility, but I think that we have very broad shoulders. Part of being a faith leader is not just faith in the divine, but faith in humanity as well. And together as a community, I think we could shock ourselves with our accomplishments. And I want to turn it over to Patricia, because Patricia will outline more details, more specifics, and the technical aspects of how faith communities can get involved.
Thank you, Rabbi. That was very beautifully stated. Thank you so much. So this work calls us to look at the various aspects of what we need to do to address these issues. Of course, there are the human needs, right? We have to look at keeping people in our community safe, especially in our family. We've got to look at some of the things that stand out the most when addressing the needs of survivors of domestic violence are things like housing, which we've been discussing all morning so far, legal representation. So many of our clients don't have access to resources to pay for an attorney. And so this is very important. It's also very important to hold the person who uses violence accountable. It's important to offer community members training and education in terms of their ability to parent effectively, because everything begins in the parent-child relationship. Survivors also need protection from law enforcement and the court system, the criminal justice system, in terms of those human needs, right? But of course, some of the challenges we face is there still, even today, remains a huge lack of knowledge. We still are up against systems of sexism and misogyny, the hatred of women, right? We still lack funding in terms of addressing this. And of course, people's will to act on behalf of these families, right? And it really does challenge us to step out of our comfort zone and, be willing to get that big picture perspective, step out of that silo and look at how what happens to people in their houses impacts every other aspect of life. And people just, we're not making those connections effectively enough, right? So some of the specific work that needs to happen in our communities is that we definitely need to be, this issue needs to be present in all of the city and county institutions, and the leadership of those institutions must lead in terms of bringing this topic up and talking about it, have that willingness to talk about it, right? We also, some of the specific work is of course calling us to provide legal representation for this vulnerable population, and look at how we can ensure that they have a place to go to, a sanctuary, whether that be immediately after violence in a shelter, or whether that be housing beyond sheltering, right? And we always need to be talking about how do we fund these services. So as citizens of this community, Are we in communication with our city council representatives and our county commissioners, talking to them about these needs of domestic violence? And are we doing enough to fund this work? Again, because domestic violence and what happens in the house is the root of all our other social problems. And then, of course, we need to be talking about, in terms of elections, like elections are coming up, and are we going to elect people that hold, people who use violence accountable for their behavior, right? Are we knowledgeable and aware of what people's candidates' stances are with regard to this issue, because they make decisions that affect our everyday life. Some of the actions that we can take, of course, are to resist that common practice and that common attitude that somebody else is going to handle that. That's not my problem. Let somebody else deal with it, right? Or I don't know how to deal with it. It doesn't matter. All of us can do something, right? We're all that someone. We're all the savior. The savior is us. And that's how we have to look at ourselves, as, being somebody that can do something, and then look for that niche. What is our niche? Where do we fit in? And what is it that I can do to address this issue of domestic violence, that will allow me to be comfortable contributing in my own personal way, right? And then, for people, for example, who are lawyers, are you willing to take one domestic violence case a month, to help people in this kind of a situation who can't get out because they can't afford a lawyer, right? Are we asking our pastors and our faith leaders to talk about domestic violence from the pulpit? Do we have committees at church who are addressing this issue, that can do something about it, right? We have to also challenge the behavior when we know that somebody in our family or in our circle, of influence, are we pulling them aside and talking to them and asking them, can we talk about this? Because this is not right, and we already know that people who get that behavior challenged by somebody that they love and respect are much more likely to consider what it is that they're doing and think about another way or get the help that they need. We need men to mentor. We need men to be there for our boys, to talk about that, healthy male masculine behavior that Rabbi spoke of, that we need to be that role model for our boys, right? We need to be willing to challenge, hitting and spanking as a form of discipline in our families, because that's where the seeds get planted for violence in our families. There's work being done in our nation, like establishing no hit zones, and ending spanking as a form of discipline in our families. That's why the Peace Initiative provides training and education through Triple P, because it teaches parents how to not be violent in their relationship with their children. And, we need to be willing to call for the ongoing and continued training and education of our community and our families at all age levels and in all the groups. And so I know it's at 10:45, and let's move into our discussion group. Thank you so much for this opportunity to